After nearly 4 decades of conflict, the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan just signed a peace agreement at the White House, with US President Donald Trump grinning like he just hosted a wedding. The deal has made headlines worldwide, so let's unpack what's going on here. What does the agreement actually say? Was it really Trump that brought peace? And what does it mean for the geopolitics of the South Caucasus? This is the Geopolitical Snapshot with your host, Politics with Paint. Now, before we jump in, just some really quick background information. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, both Armenia and Azerbaijan have been in conflict over the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, but was historically inhabited by mostly ethnic Armenians. The first war occurred in the 1990s and left the Armenians in control, but Azerbaijan took back most of the land in 2020, and in 2023 it captured what remained of the separatist region in a sudden offensive. Since then, around 100,000 ethnic Armenians fled to Armenia proper, and in the past, Russia used to mediate the conflict, but with Russia being preoccupied in Ukraine, it has allowed the US to play a significantly bigger role here than ever before. If you are interested in the broader history of the conflict, you can watch this video here I made 5 years ago. Now, what does this deal really say? First and foremost, it will mark a permanent end to the hostilities between Armenia and Azerbaijan and commit both countries to recognize each other's territorial integrity. And most importantly, it means that Armenia recognizes Azerbaijani sovereignty over Karabakh. This deal will also normalize diplomatic relations and open up both countries for trade and travel. And it commits both countries to complete the still unfinished border demarcation, which is still ongoing and something I made a video about a while ago when Armenia handed over 4 villages to Azerbaijan. But the most interesting part by far is the planned establishment of the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity. No joke, that's the actual name. This is basically a slightly revamped version of the Zangezur corridor, which Azerbaijan demanded from Armenia in order to securely access its Nakhchivan province and also gain a direct land route to its closest regional ally Turkey. But right now, it's still unclear how it will actually work in terms of rules and regulations. This route, which goes through Armenia's south, will be developed and administered by the US, which was a big surprise, because it was Russia that initially wanted to do that. Additionally, the US will lift restrictions on defense cooperation with Azerbaijan and invest in both countries' economies. But there are 2 things that are important to clarify here. Firstly, the ceremony at the White House was mostly symbolic, at least for now. Although all 3 leaders signed the agreement, it still needs to be ratified by the legislatures of Armenia and Azerbaijan, and some of the specific details still need to be agreed upon. Because of that, there are concerns that the agreement could still stall in Armenia's parliament because it likely requires constitutional amendments to remove language implying claims over Nagorno-Karabakh, which faces strong domestic opposition. Also, the current low public support for Armenia's prime minister mean ratification could become a major flashpoint. And secondly, although it may seem that the peace deal was brokered by the US, in actuality it was mostly negotiated bilaterally between Armenia and Azerbaijan. After Azerbaijan's successful 2023 offensive, both countries have been engaged in a tense and complicated peace process, which resulted in most of what the deal currently contains. The only real addition by the US to the deal was its commitment to take over responsibility over the Zangezur corridor. But if the US wasn't so deeply involved in most of the process, why would they agree to make such a spectacle out of it in the White House? Well, because both Armenia and Azerbaijan are in difficult geopolitical situations, although for different reasons. In the case of Armenia, the country has turned away from its traditional security provider Russia. For decades after its independence, Armenia aligned itself very closely to Russia, but when conflict broke out in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020, the Russians did very little to support them, especially after the war in Ukraine began in 2022. And that of course angered the Armenians, who then withdrew from more security cooperation with Russia. However, there is basically no other power that could replace them. Iran is preoccupied with its conflict in Israel, and France, the only other country that showed some interest in helping Armenia, is in no position to be a protector instead. That leaves aligning with the US for security guarantees as the only viable option. Azerbaijan, meanwhile, is in a better position, since it's much stronger than Armenia, both economically and militarily. However, it also has significant problems. Geographically, it is relatively isolated. In the south, it shares a border with Iran, which has a tense relationship with it due to fears of separatism. I made a video on this recently as well, go check it out later. And to the north, it shares a border with Russia, with whom they also have a very tense relationship. After 2020, it looked like Russia was attempting to slowly bind Azerbaijan closer to it by not outright supporting Armenia. However, the relationship turned sour after Azerbaijan used Russia's pre-occupants in Ukraine to retake all of Karabakh and force the remaining Russian peacekeepers to go home. and in 2024 an Azerbaijan Airlines plane crashed over southern Russia and Azerbaijan accused Russia of accidentally shooting it down, which the Russians denied. This soured relations so much that both countries cracked down on each other's citizens and businesses. All of this led both Armenia and Azerbaijan into the arms of the US, which now both seek to get as close to the US as possible to secure their positions in the region. And that is also the reason why both Armenia's and Azerbaijan's leaders were keen on getting on the good side of Trump by complimenting him the entire time. Now, the reactions to the deal have been quite different in the two countries. In Azerbaijan, the deal is mostly seen as a victory. The country will achieve its territorial goals, gain the long-awaited Zangezur corridor, while boosting its relationship with the US. In Armenia, reactions are much less enthusiastic. For many, it's seen as a painful and unfair compromise or even outright capitulation. The country's opposition and diaspora are very angry, and some suspect that they will try to derail the implementation of the deal. But what's in it for the US, and how will this affect the geopolitics of the South Caucasus? Well, if implemented, the deal will definitely shake things up. The US will suddenly step into a region that was long dominated by Russia. It will also be expanding its strategic influence in the region, positioning itself closely not only to Russia, but also Iran. But for Russia, this is clearly a pushback. It is increasingly losing its influence in the region, however, it would be premature to count them out completely, especially if the deal fails to be properly implemented for one reason or another. Iran is also very critical of the deal, as it will allow the US to build up a presence at its northern border. Turkey and the European Union, however, are quite happy about this. Turkey gains a direct land link to Azerbaijan, boosting its pan-Turkic aspirations for political influence and trade, and the European Union will now be less open to criticism for importing gas from Azerbaijan. But the biggest individual winner might be Trump, because he can now utilize the agreement to strengthen his case for a Nobel Peace Prize, something he apparently really wanted for a long time. The Armenia-Azerbaijan peace deal seems to really be a landmark moment in the region, which was plagued for decades by separatist conflicts. But it's not a done deal yet, and some details are still up for negotiations. But if it holds, it could change the geopolitics of the region forever. Thank you for watching, and a big thank you to all my patrons and channel members. Until next time.